They laughed when I answered, and that was how the night began, with a room full of perfume and polished teeth laughing at a woman they believed could never bite. The Harrow Foundation had rented the glass ballroom over Harbor City's river, all steel beams and winter lights, and the wives of donors had gathered in a semicircle as if gossip were a sport with referees. Someone raised a question like a toast. If your husband keeps a mistress, do you give him a road to live, or do you block every exit? The women leaned in, bracelets clinking, eyes bright with the warm cruelty of people who have never feared a rent notice. When it was my turn, I held my flute of sparkling water as if it were a microphone and answered, "No road." A small silence fell, thin and surprised. Then the laughter returned, louder, sharper, delighted by the absurdity of me pretending to hold power. "Mrs. Harrow, did we mishear?" one asked, lips curved. "You mean you wouldn't give him a way out?" Another giggled. "She's the nicest doormat in the circle. How could she say that?" I smiled with them, because smiles are safer than arguments when you are the wife chosen for a contract and not for love. Behind the laughter, I heard a different sound. The slow click of a lock turning in my mind. I had spent 5 years learning how to swallow humiliation without choking, and I had become excellent at it. Excellence, I discovered, can be repurposed. I moved through the banquet the way a host ghost moves through a house. Present enough to be used, absent enough to be ignored. Tonight was a groundbreaking celebration for Harrow Therapeutics' new manufacturing wing, and Kendrick Harrow, my father-in-law, had warned me that the family's reputation was a living thing that could bleed. "Face is the first medicine," he liked to say. The Harrows had built their empire on biotech patents and public philanthropy. But inside their mansion they still behaved like a clan guarding a dynasty. Kendrick's word was the gavel. His wife Celia had once played concert halls, and she carried that old stage arrogance into every room, insisting she was above petty chores while treating people as props that could be repositioned for better lighting. Their son Adrian was my husband-in-law and in title, the chief executive with an expensive suit and a familiar coldness behind the eyes. He was also the man who never looked at me unless he needed something fixed. I had not grown up in rooms like that. My childhood was a narrow corridor of rented spaces, the kind where winter drafts find every crack and summer heat turns wallpaper to sweat. After my parents died, my grandfather took Milo and me into his clinic apartment above a wet market. He treated dock workers, fishermen, and the women who sold vegetables before sunrise. He accepted payment in small bills, in eggs, in jars of pickled mustard, and sometimes in nothing at all. When I was 12, he put a notebook in my hands and made me write down every patient's name, not for the clinic's records, but for my own spine. "Remember them," he said. "If you forget the people, you will start worshipping the price tag." I learned to count change, to boil sterilized needles, to mop the floor after a child with fever vomited on it. I learned that dignity can live in a cracked plastic chair if the person sitting in it is treated as human. Milo had been the bright one, the brother who could solve equations faster than adults could read them. The crash that took our parents pinned him inside his body, and my grandfather's clinic became the last place that still called him by his full name rather than by a diagnosis. The day my grandfather received the first notice that Milo's new drug trial could extend his cognition, he cried with relief and then went back to work without wiping his face. That was the year Kendrick Harrow walked into our clinic with a cough that would not stop and a watch too expensive for our waiting room. He had not been rich yet, not then. He was a man scrambling for investors, desperate to keep a collapsing startup alive. My grandfather treated him with a bitter decoction and told him to stop smoking, then corrected his posture like Kendrick was a schoolboy. Kendrick returned with gifts. My grandfather refused them, and something in Kendrick's pride converted into obsession. Years later, when Milo's bills piled up like bricks, Kendrick returned with an offer disguised as gratitude. He would cover the drug trial costs and fund Milo's care. In exchange, I would marry his son. He called it joining families, a gesture of honor to the man who had helped him breathe. In private, he called it insurance, because a wife is a signature that seals a dynasty. I was 22, exhausted, and terrified of the day Milo's eyes would close again. Adrian was 28, already trained to perform charm like a public service. He told me at our first meeting that he respected loyalty and hated mess. He did not ask what I wanted. He asked what my brother's numbers were, how much the clinic needed, and whether my grandfather had left any formulas worth patenting. I signed the marriage agreement with hands that steadied only when I thought of Milo blinking at me as if he recognized my voice. I told myself I was trading my life for his, and that sacrifice was a form of love. That was the lie that helped me walk down the aisle in a dress paid for by Harrow money, while Kendrick smiled as if he had rescued me. After the wedding, the Harrow mansion swallowed me. The servants called me ma'am but never met my eyes. The board members treated me like a decorative clause. Celia corrected the way I held my fork. Adrian corrected the way I breathed. When Vera Nash appeared at Harrow headquarters a year later, young and brilliant, she wore competence like a crown and looked at me like I was the wrong woman in the right chair. I learned quickly that in the Harrow house, affection was not a feeling. It was a resource to be allocated. The doors at the ballroom opened to applause, and Adrian entered beside his executive assistant, Vera Nash. They wore matching white boutonnieres, the kind meant for a wedding party, and the crowd reacted with the pleased murmur of people watching a romance they did not have to pay for. Vera walked with practiced grace, her smile balanced between humility and ownership. When she reached me, she stopped as if courtesy were a gift she could offer or withhold. "Mrs. Harrow," she said, voice soft. "I'm sorry we arrived late. Adrian had to meet city leadership. You've worked hard tonight." I lowered my chin in the polite angle I had trained into my neck. "It's fine. You both have more important responsibilities." Her eyes flicked over my dress like a scanner at a checkout. "Oh, my car is blocking the exit lane. I parked in a rush. I don't trust staff with it. Could you move it for me?" The room's sound dimmed. Heads turned. A few wives tilted their mouths as if tasting a joke. Adrian did not speak. Kendrick was across the hall speaking to a deputy mayor, and Celia was smiling at a donor, both conveniently far from the small cruelty unfolding at my feet. "Yes," I said, as if obedience were my native language. I walked out to the cold parking deck and found Vera's car, a sleek black sedan, with a dashboard that smelled like new leather and expensive confidence. As I reversed, I remembered the first time I had driven a car, a battered second-hand hatchback my grandfather bought after a clinic. Year went well, the steering wheel sticky with age, the radio stuck on one station. My grandfather, Dr. Song, used to say, "If you cannot change the road, you must change how you walk it." He had pulled Kendrick Harrow out of snow and hunger decades ago, back when Kendrick was only a desperate man who wanted to learn medicine and escape poverty. Grandfather taught him traditional formulas and discipline, and Kendrick repaid him with loyalty that looked like reverence. When I married Adrian, Kendrick called it repayment of an old debt. It felt more like Kendrick purchasing insurance. When I returned the keys, Vera had settled beside Celia on a sofa, as if she belonged there. Celia laughed at something Vera said, a sound bright and thin like piano keys struck too hard. Adrian sat with one ankle on his knee, scrolling through his phone, ignoring me with a precision that required practice. "Took you long enough," he said without looking up. "You left the women waiting. Do you know what manners are?" The words landed like small stones. I could have explained the line of cars, the security guard's confusion, the elevator delay. Instead, I apologized, because apologies were the currency that kept the peace. Celia made a disapproving noise and swung her wine glass as she lectured me about common habits. The glass tipped, red wine splashing down onto her white heel. A house staff member stepped forward, but Celia turned to me. "You do it." I knelt, because I had learned that refusing made punishments longer. I wiped the wine from her shoe while conversations nearby continued, the way people keep eating while someone chokes at the next table. Above me, I saw Vera's mouth lift in a half-smile that was not quite hidden. Later that night, Kendrick called a family meeting. The phrase sounded civilized, but in the Harrow house it meant judgment. Kendrick sat centered on the main sofa, back straight, hands folded, his face carved into calm severity. Adrian sat to his left. My brother-in-law Quinn to Adrian's left, and Celia to Kendrick's right, eyes red as if she had already rehearsed outrage. Quinn was the quiet anomaly in the family, a university researcher who avoided politics, yet his gaze always softened when it found me, as if he remembered I was human. Kendrick spoke of reputation, of discipline, of the clan's legacy. "In public," he told Celia, "you can correct Leah without humiliating her. Humiliation is a stain people remember." Celia sniffed, insisting she had only been heated. Kendrick turned to me and asked whether I had been offended. I answered carefully, "No, Father. I understand." Kendrick nodded, satisfied by my submission, then announced Celia would be punished according to family custom. The basement herb room, hours of grinding, hands raw by morning. Celia paled and whispered about her volunteer piano performance at an orphanage. Adrian suggested leniency, not out of love for his mother but out of convenience for his schedule. Kendrick refused to break the rule. then looked at me with that calm calculation that made his kindness feel like a trap. "Leah," he said, "take the punishment in Celia's place. The family cannot halt because of one person's mistake. You have fewer obligations tomorrow." My throat tightened. Quinn stood, furious, protesting, but Kendrick's eyes cut him down with a single glance. I agreed, because I had been agreeing since the day I entered this house. The basement herb room smelled like dried roots and old stone. Shelves of jars lined the walls, labels written in Kendrick's precise hand. The grinder was heavy, its handle worn smooth by generations of punishment. I pressed down and rotated, crushing bitter leaves into powder, listening to the scrape and thunk like a metronome counting my obedience. My palms burned. My arms shook. Somewhere above, the family slept in rooms large enough to swallow a small apartment whole. At dawn, as I cleaned the mortar, Quinn appeared in the doorway holding a bowl of noodles still steaming. He set it down and, without asking, took the grinder handle from my fingers. "Stop," he said, voice rough. "You don't have to be punished for her." I tried to pull the handle back. "Quinn, if Kendrick finds you here, he'll add hours." Quinn's jaw tightened. "Let him," he muttered, and he ground the herbs with silent rage. I ate the noodles with hands that trembled so badly the chopsticks clicked against the bowl. Quinn watched me as if he wanted to say something that might change everything. Then he backed away, leaving before fear could make him stay. 3 hours later, I returned upstairs, every tendon in my hands screaming. I found Adrian in my bedroom on my bed, even though we had slept in separate rooms for 2 years. He lay stiffly, eyes half closed, breath sharp. Adrian had a condition no one discussed out loud, a physical dysfunction that turned intimacy into a mechanical crisis. When it flared, only one thing calmed it: acupuncture, precise and controlled. My grandfather had taught me when I was a teenager, and Kendrick had pushed me to practice, because a daughter-in-law who could fix his air was useful. Adrian's voice was hoarse. "Come here." I lifted my shaking hands. "Not tonight. I can't hold the needles." His gaze hardened. "Then do something else." He said it like an order to a nurse. The humiliation tasted metallic in my mouth. I swallowed it and tried to explain that the hospital had called about Milo's medication payment due at midnight, that my brother's treatment could not pause without risking regression. Adrian reached for his phone, transferred the money with 2 taps, and tossed the phone onto the sheets as if he had thrown a coin to a beggar. "Now," he said, and I stepped forward because if I refused, Kendrick would call it disobedience, and disobedience was a crime in this house. I undressed with hands that would not stop trembling. The room spun slightly, and nausea rose without warning. I bent and vomited onto the duvet, splattering Adrian's thigh. Adrian swore and lunged toward the bathroom, disgusted. He was obsessive about cleanliness, and shame clung to him like a suit. When he returned, freshly showered, he did not ask whether I was ill. He put on his clothes, called someone, and said, "Tonight, I'm coming over." He left without a backward glance, and at the doorway he turned just enough to deliver a final cut. "Leah, I want to see how long you can keep pretending." The next morning I visited Milo's clinic. Milo had been a mathematics prodigy, until a highway crash took our parents and left him trapped in his own body. An imported drug had awakened his eyes, and with them a fragile hope. But the cost was a tide that never stopped rising. My grandfather had carried that cost on his shoulders until his health broke. He had died stirring a pot of medicine, sweat on his brow, fingers stained with herbs. After he died, the Harrow's kindness thinned into bureaucracy. Adrian paid because Kendrick ordered it, not because Adrian cared. I sat beside Milo and told him about the gala in careful, neutral language, because the truth felt too heavy for a man who could not move. Milo blinked slowly, and I pretended each blink was a conversation. I drove to Harrow headquarters with a thermos of ginger tea for Adrian, because routines keep monsters calm. On the elevator, I rehearsed my request for the next month's clinic payment. Adrian's office door was open. Inside, Kendrick's brother and cousins sat around a table, their suits identical, their smiles rehearsed. They looked up at me as if I were a piece of furniture that had started speaking. I heard one cousin joke about money poured into a corpse, and my face held still because my anger was not yet useful. Adrian took the tea, swallowed pills I handed him without looking, and waved me away when his phone rang. "Leave," he said. "I'm on a call." His cousin snickered. I stepped out, the door clicking shut behind me, and the click sounded like a latch. That evening, on my drive home, a truck slammed into my car from behind. The impact snapped my head forward and back, a white explosion behind my eyes. For a moment, the world narrowed to the taste of blood and the sound of metal folding. Then darkness rolled in like a tide. When light returned, it was fluorescent and cruel, a grid of ceiling tiles above a hospital bed. A nurse told me I had been unconscious for 5 days. 5 days of silence. 5 days of the Harrows operating without me. 5 days in which I was an object instead of a witness. The house manager arrived, eyes rimmed in red, and spoke as if reciting a report. Adrian Harrow had died the night of my accident. He had collapsed in a private suite. Doctors could not revive him. The foundation had announced sudden complications. The memorial had already been held, the cremation already completed. Kendrick had handled everything. Celia had wept dramatically. Vera Nash had stood beside them, wearing white mourning flowers, looking like a widow in a photograph. I listened without crying. Tears require belief, and I had stopped believing Adrian belonged to me long before his heart stopped. Kendrick arrived at the hospital with lawyers. Celia followed, anger disguised as grief. "You lie here eating while your husband is gone," she hissed. A nurse scolded her for causing a scene. Kendrick did not apologize for the intrusion. He spoke gently, the way a doctor speaks before a painful injection. "Leah, there are procedures," he said. "You must sign documents. The company cannot pause." The lawyer placed a folder in front of me, a waiver renouncing my inheritance rights. Kendrick's phone buzzed as he texted board members about an emergency meeting, already acting as if my signature were a formality. I rubbed my temples slowly. "If I don't sign," I asked, voice flat. "I'm allowed not to sign, correct?" The lawyer hesitated, then admitted the truth. Kendrick's eyes sharpened. I smiled and said, "Then I won't sign." Kendrick's face did not change, but the air thickened. He shifted tactics, offering me a small apartment, as appreciation, an apartment that had once been his first foothold in the city. I refused politely and suggested he keep it for his retirement. Kendrick left with his smile intact, but his footsteps sounded heavier. A young nurse told me that while I lay unconscious, only one family member visited, Quinn. He had arranged a VIP room, hired night attendants, sat beside my bed with a look of helpless fury. I believed her, because Quinn's kindness was the only thing in that house that had never been transactional. When I returned home, police asked for a statement. They asked why Adrian had taken an antibiotic when the family insisted I brought herbal syrup. They asked if I knew he drank whiskey afterward. I widened my eyes and let my voice wobble. "He asked me to buy it," I said. "He said he had important work." Then I asked my own questions. Who was with him when he drank? Who drove him to the hospital? If someone knew he had taken medication, why offer alcohol? Police turned their gaze toward Vera, and Vera's composure cracked like thin ice. She claimed she had not known. Celia, hearing Vera admit she had been drinking with Adrian for support, understood what support meant and slapped Vera hard enough to make the room ring. Kendrick shouted for them to stop, not out of morality, but because loss of control in front of police was bad optics. Someone filmed the scene. In a mansion like that, cameras are everywhere, even when Kendrick insists they are not. The video leaked overnight. The city ate it like candy. Commentators mocked Adrian's private weakness, condemned Vera's ambition, laughed at Celia's class, questioned Kendrick's honor. For once, the Harrows could not buy silence fast enough. Kendrick summoned me back to the mansion, believing my presence could soften the narrative, because a grieving widow made the family look structured. I returned because storms reveal rot. Quinn took leave from his lab and sat in meetings, shoulders tense, learning an industry he despised. In the garden, he bandaged my finger when a thorn bit, and his hands trembled. "You shouldn't have carried their sins," he said. I answered truthfully. "I carried them because I wanted them to forget they should fear me." Quinn stared as if he had never met me before. The leak did more than embarrass the family. It destabilized their money. Harrow Therapeutics depended on trust, the way a hospital depends on electricity. Investors do not like messy families because messy families create messy spreadsheets. By the following morning, the company's communications director, Jasper Lynn, stood in the mansion foyer with 2 phones pressed between shoulder and ear, sweat on his upper lip. He tried to herd Kendrick toward a prepared statement, tried to coach Celia into silence, and tried to locate Vera before reporters did. Kendrick's first instinct was to buy the platform that carried the clip. He offered an obscene sum for removal, and the platform declined politely, because by then other accounts had already copied it. His second instinct was to bury the story under a larger story. Jasper suggested a donation announcement, A city partnership, a new children's ward. Kendrick approved, and within hours the foundation released glossy photos of Adrian shaking hands with patients from months earlier. The city was not moved. The city is rarely moved by sincerity after it has tasted blood. Anonymous accounts began to post about Adrian's health, about the clinic bills, about the rumors of a secret child. Some posts were accurate, others were crafted to distract. I recognized Kendrick's fingerprints in the ones that painted me as a greedy wife who had trapped a fragile man. Jasper asked Kendrick whether to refute. Kendrick said no. "Let her wear it," he murmured. "The public likes a villain." I met Jasper in the hallway and told him something he did not expect. "If you want the story to end, stop lying." Jasper stared at me as if I had spoken another language. He lowered his voice. "Mrs. Harrow, in our field we do not end stories, we redirect them," I replied. "Then redirect it toward the truth, because the lie will devour you." He looked away, and in that tiny turn of his head I saw a man who was tired of serving powerful people's delusions. That week the board held an emergency call. I dialed in from my hospital bed, voice calm, and asked the chair whether the company had taken out key person insurance on Adrian. There was a pause. The CFO answered that such insurance existed. "Then the policy requires a cause of death review," I said. "Are we prepared for an investigation that includes toxicology?" No one answered. I continued. "If we push product launches before the review, we risk lawsuits. If we hide the review, we risk regulators. If we silence the widow, we create a new clip tomorrow." Kendrick's breath sounded rough over the line, like a man swallowing gravel. After the call, 2 men arrived at my hospital room who introduced themselves as private investigators hired by the foundation. Their politeness was practiced. They asked me to describe the crash. They asked whether I recognized the truck's license plate. They asked whether I had noticed any brakes failing before impact. I answered with enough detail to satisfy them, and enough vagueness to keep them hungry. When one asked, almost casually, whether I had been wearing a seatbelt, I smiled and said, "Why does that matter to a company accountant?" His eyes flickered. The question had not been about safety. It had been about blame. In the days that followed, the police report arrived. The truck driver claimed his brakes failed. The maintenance log was incomplete. The driver's phone showed calls to an unregistered number in the hour before the crash. I requested the call records through my lawyer. Kendrick's lawyer denied the request. I requested them through the police. The police said they needed time. Time, I learned, is the richest currency in Harbor City because it can be spent to make evidence disappear. Quinn visited my hospital room with a paper bag of steamed buns that he pretended were from a random shop. He kept his eyes on the floor as he spoke. "My father is panicking," he said. "He thinks the crash was meant for someone else." "I did not ask who," Quinn added. "Vera has been meeting with a man in procurement, the one who signs vehicle contracts. I saw them in the parking garage." He handed me a receipt he had picked up from the floor near the procurement office, a payment confirmation from a small repair company that did not exist in official records. I did not immediately accuse anyone. Accusations are bullets you cannot put back into the gun. Instead, I asked my lawyer to send a preservation notice to the company demanding that all procurement emails, security logs, and garage footage be retained. The notice was routine, boring, legal. It also made it a crime to destroy certain records. Kendrick called my hospital room and spoke gently, as if I were a feverish child. "Leah," he said, "you are making enemies with paperwork." I answered, "I already had enemies, Kendrick. The paperwork is how I name them." Weeks passed. Kendrick's urgency grew. Harrow Therapeutics had a flagship product line ready for launch, a traditional wellness tonic, marketed as a bridge between science and heritage. My grandfather had once refused to sign off on the formula, calling it diluted sugar water disguised as medicine. After his death, Kendrick pushed it through anyway, adding a thin layer of botanical extract to satisfy regulators while selling it as century-old healing. Adrian's death left the project stalled, because major sign-offs required an heir's authorization. Kendrick called me to headquarters and spoke as if offering a privilege. "You will sign these," he said, sliding papers toward me. "It is best for the family and the company." I read, kept my face neutral, then set the pen down. "I object," I said. "This product should not be released." Kendrick's gaze sharpened into something feral. For the first time, he did not bother with soft language. "Explain," he demanded. I looked directly at him. "You are selling sugar syrup as medicine," I said, my voice calm. and using my grandfather's name like a brand stamp. It is fraud wrapped in tradition. The boardroom fell silent. Kendrick's brother slammed the table. Cousins shouted. They threatened me with debts Adrian supposedly owed them. They waived promissory notes and demanded compensation for lost profits. I listened, then asked, "And where did your investment funds come from?" The cousins went still. Their money had always been suspicious. Too large, too quiet. Passed through Adrian's accounts so their government positions would not be questioned. "Sue me," I said softly. "File your notes in court." Their faces tightened, because lawsuits require daylight, and daylight burns people with hidden pockets. That afternoon I hired security. I sold 3 of Adrian's watches, gifts he had never worn for me, only for public photos, and used the cash to pay 4 bodyguards. Kendrick called it theatrics. I called it survival. I moved out of the mansion into an apartment I had leased quietly months earlier, a place with windows that overlooked the river and a front desk that kept names private. Quinn called, voice strained. "I can't defend what my family did," he said. "But I can defend you." I stared at the river's dark surface. "I don't need you to choose sides," I told him. "I need you to choose truth." He inhaled as if truth was heavy. "I choose you," he said, then corrected himself quickly, as if frightened by his own honesty. "I choose what's right." I did not respond, because some promises are too fragile to touch. A month later, the inheritance negotiation convened at a law office with thick carpets that muted footsteps, as if the building had been designed to hide conflict. Kendrick sat at one end of the long table, Celia beside him, faces tight. I sat at the other end, alone on purpose. Lawyers reviewed Adrian's estate. Shares, properties, trusts, and the family's complex corporate shell designed to keep wealth from wandering outside the bloodline. Kendrick's plan was simple. Shame me into surrender, then proceed as if Adrian's widow had been a temporary inconvenience. Midway through the reading, the door opened. Vera entered, holding the hand of a small boy. The child's cheeks were round, his eyes sharp, his hair the same shade as Adrian's. Vera placed a sealed envelope on the table like a weapon. "DNA results," she announced. "He is Adrian's son. He is entitled." Kendrick's expression softened, not with love, but with relief. Celia's lips trembled. The boy called Kendrick grandfather, as if the word had been practiced. Lawyers turned to me, expecting collapse. Vera watched me with a smile that begged for my humiliation. I asked a single question. "If the deceased left a will, does it override statutory inheritance?" The lead attorney answered automatically, "Yes." I nodded and removed a laminated document from my folder. "Then read this," I said. It was Adrian's handwritten will, notarized, dated, witnessed. It declared that all assets would pass to the child formed within his lawful marriage. Vera laughed. "You have no child," she said. Kendrick's eyes narrowed, suspicious now. The attorney frowned, because intent and execution are 2 different beasts. "This clause may be inapplicable," he said, "unless there is a child." I looked at him steadily. "There is," I said, and the room shifted as if the air itself had leaned forward. I explained, slowly, without drama. Before the marriage, Kendrick had demanded an heir plan. Adrian's condition made natural conception unlikely, and Kendrick feared a public scandal about impotence more than he feared moral compromise. Under family pressure, Adrian had provided genetic material for IVF. Embryos had been created using my eggs under contract terms so strict they could have been written by a prison warden. The embryos were stored at a clinic under the Harrow Foundation's name, and I had been told I would never be allowed to use them unless Kendrick approved. Adrian had written the will after one late-night fight, in which he admitted he feared his father more than he loved anyone. "If I die," Adrian had said then, voice raw, "my father will erase you. I can't stop him while I'm alive. I can only set traps." The will was one of those traps. Kendrick exploded, calling the document forged, demanding immediate sealing of medical records. Vera shouted that it was nonsense. Celia looked like she might faint. The attorneys requested verification. The court ordered the clinic to provide records under seal. The records confirmed the embryos existed, created during my marriage, with Adrian as genetic father. Vera's claim, while true, did not satisfy the will's condition, because the will's language specified lawful marriage parentage, not biology alone. Vera's child was eligible under default law, but the will diverted assets into a trust tied to the embryos, delaying distribution. Kendrick had built his empire on controlling timelines. Now a timeline controlled him. Kendrick tried other angles. He accused me of engineering Adrian's death. He whispered to board members that I was unstable. He offered settlements that sounded generous until you saw the hooks. He even tried to convince Quinn to testify against me by promising Quinn a higher position in the company. Quinn refused, and Kendrick's disappointment toward his younger son looked like disgust. Vera attempted to sway public sympathy by posing as a single mother abandoned by a dead man. The city's appetite for scandal shifted from laughter to fascination. Commentators argued about morality, about legal definitions, about whether a contract child was more legitimate than a love child. I kept my mouth closed in public, because the loudest voice often loses. While lawyers battled, I visited the places that reminded me who I was. I went to the tire shop where my grandfather once bought cheap repair kits, and drank bitter tea with the owner, a man whose hands were always stained with grease. I listened as he told stories of grandfather treating neighbors who could not pay, of grandfather refusing gifts that felt like bribes, of grandfather's stubborn insistence on writing every patient's name by hand. I arranged for the shop owner's rent to be reduced through a foundation program, but I did it quietly, making it look like an anonymous community grant. In the Harrow world, charity was a spotlight. In my world, care was a lamp left on in a hallway so someone would not trip in the dark. The ethical fight became my second war. Harrow Therapeutics had already manufactured a massive batch of the Heritage Tonic, ready to ship the moment paperwork cleared. I requested an audit. Kendrick refused. I then contacted a regulator, not with accusations, but with questions that forced scrutiny. Regulators arrived, polite and relentless. They demanded ingredient sourcing documentation. They asked for clinical substantiation of marketing claims. They compared labels to lab results. The board panicked. Kendrick blamed me, but he could not admit out loud that the product was designed to profit from belief rather than proof. When regulators found inconsistencies, shipping halted. Kendrick's brother cursed me as a traitor to the family. I replied, in writing, that my grandfather had been loyal to medicine, not to their surname. Months later, the court issued an interim ruling. The will would stand pending full validation. Adrian's estate would be placed in trust. Leah Song, as spouse and co-creator of the embryos, would serve as trustee with oversight. Vera's child would receive support but not control. Kendrick would retain his personal assets, but lose leverage over Adrian's shares. Celia screamed in the courthouse hallway and called me cold. I did not correct her. Coldness is sometimes the temperature required to keep something from rotting. In the quiet between hearings, Quinn visited my apartment. He looked exhausted, hair uncombed, eyes carrying shadows. He set a folder on my table. Internal emails, project memos, and a recorded board call in which Kendrick discussed guiding the narrative of Adrian's death to protect the company. "I shouldn't be giving this to you," Quinn said, voice shaking, "but I can't stand watching him crush you." I opened the folder slowly, because gratitude can be dangerous when it turns into debt. "You're not giving this to me," I said. "You're giving it to the truth." Quinn's mouth twitched as if he wanted to smile but did not remember how. He left before midnight, and I watched the elevator doors close with a familiar ache that had nothing to do with romance and everything to do with being seen. Spring arrived, and Milo's doctor called to say Milo's vitals had improved. The experimental drug was working. Slowly, expensively, relentlessly. I sat beside Milo and read him the judge's ruling in plain language, then read him an ordinary novel afterward, just to remind him that stories can be about more than survival. Milo blinked twice, then 3 times, and I took it as a sign, because hope is often built from tiny gestures. I began the legal steps to relocate the embryos to a hospital with strict oversight. I did not decide yet whether I would carry a child, use a surrogate, or not use them at all. The point was no longer to satisfy Kendrick's obsession. The point was to reclaim choice. Vera, cornered, tried one last gamble. She produced a second DNA report claiming the first had been tampered, and she accused me of bribing the lab. Investigators traced her payments to a private fixer known for forged results. Vera's charges were not about adultery. They were about fraud. She cried in court, insisting she had done it for her son. The judge responded with the kind of fatigue reserved for people who always excuse harm as love. Kendrick attended Vera's hearing and did not look at her once, because Kendrick loved tools, not people. When Vera finally understood she had been a tool, her expression broke into something almost human. Kendrick's power shrank with each ruling, yet he remained dangerous, like a wounded animal that still knows where your throat is. He offered me a private meeting at the old apartment he once lived in, the one he had tried to gift me as a bribe. I arrived with security. Kendrick served tea himself, hands steady, face almost gentle. "Leah," he said, "we can end this. You can take money and leave. I will raise the boy as Harrow blood. The world will forget." I set my cup down without drinking. "The world forgets," I said. "But records don't." Kendrick's eyes flicked toward my bodyguards. "You think you're safe because you hired men with muscles," he scoffed. I shook my head. "I'm safe because you taught me to respect face," I said. "Now I know how to ruin yours." Kendrick's mouth tightened. It was the first time I saw fear behind his calculation. Not fear of losing money, but fear of losing control over how he was seen. The final hearing came in late autumn. The court validated Adrian's will. It recognized the embryos as potential lawful offspring under the jurisdiction's parentage statutes, contingent upon legal steps that the trustee could initiate without coercion. It divided Kendrick's influence from Adrian's estate, separating the dynasty's past from its future. It also ordered increased oversight of Harrow Therapeutics' marketing claims, a consequence of my audit requests and regulators' findings. Kendrick lost more than shares. He lost the ability to hide behind philanthropy, as if donations washed away deception. Celia's piano charity events were quietly canceled. The foundation's board demanded restructuring. In a single season, the Harrow's face fractured into pieces too small to reassemble. On a gray morning after the verdict, I stood on the courthouse steps and watched pedestrians hurry past, unaware of the private wars that had ended inside. Quinn joined me, coat collar raised against the wind. "Where do you go now?" he asked. I answered honestly. "Somewhere that doesn't require me to kneel." Quinn's eyes warmed, and he said, "If you ever need help building it, I'll show up." I believed him, not because he was perfect, but because he had finally stopped hiding behind his family's gravity. I did not destroy the Harrows completely, even though I could have. I left Kendrick and Celia the small apartment above the old storefront pharmacy, the place where their story had started. I arranged it through legal channels as a settlement term, framed as support rather than mercy, because Kendrick could accept support without admitting he needed it. When I visited weeks later, Celia opened the door with trembling hands and looked at me as if I were a judge. Kendrick stood behind her, spine rigid, eyes dull. On their table lay a cheap tea set, the kind grandfather used when he served patients who had nothing to offer. Kendrick stared at it like it was an insult. I looked around the cramped rooms and felt no triumph. I felt a quiet clarity, like clean air after smoke. Milo did not wake fully that year, but his eyes held more light, and his fingers twitched once when I placed my hand beside his. I took that twitch and built a new schedule around it. Clinic meetings in the morning, board oversight in the afternoon, and Milo's bedside in the evening with books and updates, and the steady insistence that he was still here. I launched a foundation program that funded real community clinics rather than gala photographs. I required transparency reports and independent audits. Donors complained about the bureaucracy, and I smiled, because bureaucracy is what happens when you refuse to trust powerful people's promises. On the next anniversary of the gala, I did not attend a ballroom. I attended a community health fair in a public school gymnasium, where the floor smelled like old wood and children's sneakers. I wore a plain coat. A volunteer offered me coffee and asked, casually, whether I missed the luxury. I thought of the wives laughing at my answer, of Vera's car keys in my hand, of Celia's wine on her shoe, of Kendrick's folder demanding my surrender. "I miss the person I was before I learned how cheap cruelty can be," I said. Then I added quietly, "But I don't miss needing permission to survive." That night I walked along the river, where the gala lights had once glittered. The city